I think I'm in the minority here as far as Yu-Gi-Oh channels go, but for the most part, I don't like making a ton of predictions about how good a card will be. I like focusing on events that have already happened and cards that have already seen experimentation to really get the best idea of how strong a card is. I always bring up Pot of Desires. One of the reasons that I talk about that card so much and cards like Chaos Max Dragon is that we've had them around for so long that we know how good or bad they are. It's really cool for me to then look at those cards in a historical context and say, well, why were these cards played or why weren't these cards played? That's really cool for me personally. I mention all this because I chickened out from making this video before YCS Chicago. I really wanted to talk about why Witch's Strike wasn't a good card, but I'm so worried about making a wrong prediction. I just wanted to wait until after the event to see if maybe I miscalculated how powerful or not powerful the card actually was. Witch's Strike is one of those cards that looks extremely good on paper, and I think the surface level analysis is, yes, if you resolve Witch's Strike, you will probably win that game, and I think a lot of players really thought this card would be super powerful at YCS Chicago. However, the card saw zero play at the top tables and didn't find its way into any top cut decks, and in today's video I want to talk about why Witch's Strike as well as cards similar to it don't really tend to see play competitively. First off, let's take a look at what Witch's Strike does and answer a few common ruling questions that I see people ask about. Witch's Strike is a trap card, not a counter trap card, and it says if your opponent negates a normal summon or special summon of a monster or monsters or the activation of a card or effect, destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. Now there are a few things that confuse people about this card. First off, this does not chain to the card that is negating the activation or the summon, and that's important because one of the best things to use this against is Solemn Strike, and if this card had to respond directly to the card being activated, you couldn't actually use it against the Solemn cards because those are all counter traps and this one is not. So this card activates on a new chain after the negation happens. It doesn't stop the negation from happening. It happens on a separate chain and then you blow up all of your opponent's cards. Also, I think one huge area where a lot of people were confused on, I've talked about this a few times, this card does not stop Ash Blossom. I saw so many comments from people saying Witch's Strike is an excellent counter to Ash Blossom. Ash Blossom is one of the most powerful and popular hand traps out there right now. Of course, everyone's going to play Witch's Strike because it punishes players so hard. The fact of the matter is, and I've mentioned this a few times now, that Ash Blossom does not negate activations. It only negates effects, and therefore it does not meet the criteria for Witch's Strike's activation requirement, which means that Witch's Strike is pretty much regarded as a counter to the Solemns as well as cards like Altergeist Protocol, and overall those cards are played in decks like Altergeist and a few other decks, maybe even like the Subterra list. I think we're playing the Solemns, but that's pretty much all you're able to use Witch's Strike against. There certainly are other forms of negation out there right now, but a lot of them don't negate activations. Things like Infinite Impermanence, probably one of the most common forms of effect negation, it just negates a face-up monster's effects. It doesn't actually negate any activations, which means that Witch's Strike doesn't counter that card. I've seen a ton of confusion about Witch's Strike, and I think a lot of it stems from people just not really understanding what this card can actually be used against. What's interesting about this card is that I think that there are two non-gameplay elements that actually made this card more hyped than it would have been without these. For example, I think the first reason this card was hyped up so much was because it has the Solemn lore going along in it. People really like Solemn cards, and because this includes many of the characters in the Solemn artworks in this artwork, I think that just the very fact that it was tied to Solemns actually increased the hype people had for it. I also think the fact this card was a secret rare in the TCG makes people more excited for it, and the reason that I say that is because if we think back to sets like Cybernetic Horizon, cards like Pinpoint Landing and Celestial Observatory might not have gotten a second look if they weren't secret rares. Whenever there are mediocre cards printed as secret rares, I think that in general they are more likely to have people experiment with them versus if they were commons or super rares, if only for people buying boxes, pulling them and saying, well, I want to at least get some use out of this card. Neither of those things are gameplay elements, but I think that they certainly played a factor in how much hype and discussion was surrounding Witch's Strike. I'm going to compare Witch's Strike to a few cards in a couple minutes here, but what I want to say before I do that is that Witch's Strike, like a couple of the other cards I'm going to talk about, is one of those cards that on paper to a lot of people seems broken because they're only thinking of the optimal situations for the card. Yes, I will admit, if your opponent activates a Solemn Strike and you flip Witch's Strike after the chain resolves, you'll probably win that game like 90% of the of time. Getting rid of all of their cards on field and in hand is a ridiculously good counter to a Solemn card, especially considering many of the decks playing Solemn cards invest heavily in playing back row where Witch's Strike really shines. I will say though that like the other cards I'm going to talk about, Witch's Strike suffers because there are many situations where you'll draw the card and your opponent won't have the Solemn Strike, or you'll draw it too late. It's a card that you only want to see on the first turn, and even on the first turn it's not a guarantee. And I think that all it really takes is for people to sit down and play a ton of games with Witch's Strike to understand why it's bad. If you don't have time for that though, which is perfectly understandable, just picture this scenario. You go first with 5 cards. One of those 5 cards is one singular copy of Witch's Strike. This means with the 5 cards that you have, one of them is a do nothing card on the first turn. It doesn't actually help you start your combos. It doesn't even help your board be protected. It's just a blank card for your first turn. That's not even the worst part though. The worst part is that when your opponent's turn comes around, now they have 6 real cards that can break your board, but oh wait, your board isn't 5 cards, it's only 4 cards, because going second, your opponent really isn't going to be activating things that Witch's Strike can stop, which means that Witch's Strike isn't just a blank card when you go first, it's also a blank card on your opponent's first turn, and that's a lot of turns where you just have a card that you simply can't activate. It's very likely that Witch's Strike will just get hit by something like Twin Twisters or Evenly Match or anything along those lines, and in that regard it could have just been any trap card, but you probably would have wished it was a trap card that could actually do something. I don't think it's worth dwelling too much on how bad the card is when you go second, because Witch's Strike is pretty clearly a side deck card that you'd only play when you went first, but it is worth mentioning if you go second, the card is way worse than if you go first, because then you can't even activate it until like 4 turns into the game. And part of the problem with Witch's Strike is that your opponent is going to pick apart your board when you go first. They want to use cards that destroy all of your stuff, and you need to have real live cards to actually react to what your opponent is doing. A card like Witch's Strike is simply not going to be that relevant, because a lot of the time, if we're being completely honest here, if you are down a card on your first turn because you have a card like Witch's Strike that is just a blank card, your opponent is going to very easily break through your board and set up their own board, and at that point you might not even have enough cards to bait their negation anyway, if they even drew it in the first place. And I'm sure that fans of Witch's Strike probably won't change their mind. If you're someone that really likes the card, even after I said all of that and analyzed it, you're probably still saying, but Doug, you're just cherry picking the bad situations. The good thing is that we have the data to back up that the card is simply not performing as well as a lot of people thought it would. Witch's Strike is simply too linear, even if its payoff is crazy, and we've seen cards like this in the past, and actually the cards that I'm going to mention have all seen fringe play in some formats, very much in the same case that Witch's Strike might eventually see play if there are enough negation cards running around. The cards that remind me of Witch's Strike the most are things like Mystical Ref Panel and Waking the Dragon and Retort. These cards are all cards that you want to have on the first turn in order to specifically counter things that your opponent is doing. In the case of Mystical Ref Panel and Retort, you're trying to counter some cards that your opponent might be playing in mirror matches. In the case of Waking the Dragon, you're trying to counter things like Twin Twisters and jamming waves and things that destroy your back row. These types of cards are very high risk, high reward. A lot of the times you'll just simply be sitting with them in your back row and they don't help you create your board in the first place, which means that you already have to open a good hand to make a board and then have those cards as backup just in case your opponent has these specific cards that actually trigger their effects. However, it is worth mentioning that all 3 of these cards have seen some competitive experimentation, although it is a little bit fringe. In the case of Retort and Mystical Ref Panel, pretty much anytime there is like a tier 0 format where you know there's one deck that you're going to play every single round, those types of cards always come up in discussions for mirror matches for the same reasons that Witch's Strike comes up in discussions against decks like Altergeist. It seems really good when they go off, and they never quite become the standard pick, but certainly they still see some tops here and there depending on the format. In the case of Waking the Dragon, it's seen play on and off ever since its release. It's one of those cards that when it resolves, you'll probably win the game, just like all the ones in this video, but actually triggering it is pretty hard. In the case of Waking the Dragon, you literally can't activate it. It's entirely dependent on what your opponent has, and as someone that has played a ton of events with Waking the Dragon before cutting it eventually, it's a card that is very frustrating to use. I'll just say that outright, because a lot of the times you set Waking the Dragon and your opponent Twin Twisters and hits your other back row. Now you have this dead card here. A lot of the times, like, yeah, even when it does resolve, sometimes it's not quite enough. Your opponent can just stall out in time, or they can make a huge board still. It's hard playing cards like that where you're not really in control of whether or not that you can activate them or not. Overall, these problems are the things that plague Witch's Strike, although it seems like Witch's Strike is even harder to activate than many of those other cards because it has so few uses. It's only good against a handful of cards against basically one matchup, and that's just Altergeist. And I think in a lot of cases you'd rather just play cards like Wiretap or Evenly Match or Inspect Your Border for the mirror match instead of using a card to specifically counter the Solemns. Not to mention it's a terrible top deck. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video on Witch's Strike. Maybe this card will be competitive someday. Maybe it'll see fringe play in side decks. I can't wait to find out. But I'll see you later. Goodbye.